Welcome to our continuing series, Evenings with Sraddhalu.
Namaste.
Well, we have some very interesting questions here, and one of these is about stars and galaxies. How can flying saucers reach other stars without spending years to travel? And then, consequent to that, what will be the fuel, the energy they use to travel? And what is the 0-point energy or free energy? Good question.
We have to put this in context with our discussion last time.
Yes.
Where the two important ideas. First was that everywhere in the universe, wherever there is matter, there has to be life. Wherever there is life, there has to be mind, consciousness emergent. Because there is an involution, and this is Sri Aurobindo's part of the basic philosophy, that a spiritual consciousness reduces itself, involves to become mind, life, and eventually matter. And locked into matter, eventually life pushes out to emerge everywhere without exception. This is a very important idea which should be part of our textbooks as children. We should have grown up with the idea that everywhere life exists. Now, it may have evolved to different degrees, and we may then recognize that our Earth is one of the youngest planets. 4 billion years at least, according to science. And there are out there suns which are much older, and their solar systems which are much older. And so if in 4 billion years we can get to where we are, throw in another few million years, barely a few percentages more, or throw in 500 million years more, and that would be barely 10%, 12% more. And how much could happen for us? How much more we could evolve if we continued at this pace? And out there, obviously, there have to be civilizations which are that much evolved or even more evolved, and some which are less evolved, or planets where life is less evolved. And so our perspective of the universe changes. We have to now recognize if there are literally trillions of galaxies, and in each galaxy trillions of stars, and for each star at least a few dozen planets, a dozen planets, and upon some of them at least life evolving, there has to be lots of life, but all kinds of life equally. So the diversity of life forms emergent on Earth is so great. And just because the human being has evolved to become a conscious mind does not mean that others cannot evolve given enough time. So equally there could be life forms elsewhere which are amphibious, but which are reasoning, thinking beings. And so last time we also touched upon this idea that there is a prototype framework for the thinking conscious being, which is this 5-pointed star as we described it. So this is the second important idea, that evolution being everywhere in the material plane, in the universe, obviously if they have evolved sufficiently, they should be able to travel across great distances. And then the question is, how do they do it? And have they visited us? The evidence from the human past, going back even a few thousand years, is overwhelming, that we have been visited by beings from other planets. Now we could say they're coming from our own Earth. Maybe there are civilizations inside the Earth who are coming out and visiting us, but that would not explain why they would remain hidden for so long. And it does not explain the fact that many of them who have visited the Earth and met with human beings have told them, we have come from such and such planet or star system. There's this classic example of a tribe in Africa which worships a particular star, the Dogon star, I believe. Or is it Dogon tribe?
It's the Dogon country.
Dogon country.
It's in Mali, I think.
In Mali, okay. And they look at a particular star which is sacred for them. And so when the Europeans visited them, they said, well, what is it about the star? They looked at the myths around it. And the Dogon people have this belief that it's a twin star. It's not one star, it's two revolving around each other. It's a binary star. And there are planets around it. And beings from that planet have come and met them and given them basic knowledge of life. And so when this was first recorded, our telescopes were not powerful enough to actually be able to see what the star was like. Subsequently, our telescopes confirm it's a binary star. Now, how do you explain that? Here's a very ancient tradition that says there's a binary star and people from there have come and taught them. And because they're disc shaped, they come and land, people come out, meet with human beings, go away, and sometimes with repeated contact. They take time to learn the human languages in order to be able to interface with us and so on. But I was speaking of evidence going far back. You have paintings in old churches in Europe going back 500 years which show flying discs with light radiating around. You have cave paintings which show flying discs. We recently discovered in India, in Chhattisgarh, there's a whole system of paintings on caves which are dated going back more than 5,000 years, which show human beings wearing space suits and flying discs with light radiating, or flying saucer-shaped discs with light radiating. And all these point to the fact that humanity has been visited for a very long time. The question, of course, is how do they travel so fast? How much time do they take to travel? Maybe they traveled for a few hundred years, because according to current science, you cannot go faster than the speed of light. If that is the case, then the nearest star system from us is 4 light years away. That means if you travel at the speed of light, it will take you 4 years. Since you can't travel at the speed of light, it will take you at least, at the very least, a dozen years, maybe more, just to go from one end to the other. How do you survive in space? And what kind of propellant do you have which can keep you going for 12 years and then slow down and then come back? So from our current technology, it's impossible to be able to do that. But we can certainly conceive that in time the technologies could improve. Is there a framework with which we can understand this? So there are 2 ways to approach this. One is look at the evidence of what beings from those planets have said to human beings when they meet, of how they travel. And I've looked at a lot of this literature. There's several kinds of propulsion systems which are recorded. One of the things which we have seen, I mean by we, humanity, has seen when these flying saucers come in Earth's atmosphere, they travel extremely fast, much faster than anything which we have of human technology. So the earliest recent recordings of their interactions with humans or challenges to human space flight or aeronautics is during the Second World War, when certain flying craft were seen paralleling the British planes, except that they would fly along, they were like glowing balls, and then suddenly they would zoom off at high speed, and leaving behind no wake, no shaking of the air, which would have shaken the plane otherwise.
So the movement is silent.
Absolutely silent, no sound, and then they move at the pace of the plane. When the plane turns, they follow, so intelligent life, and then suddenly they zoom off, just like that, vertically. And so fast that literally they seem to vanish.
What were they doing?
They were observing.
Observing.
Because a lot of things were happening during the Second World War. There were efforts to develop dangerous weapons, particularly nuclear weapons, which had created for them, sent out dangerous signals. Here's a civilization on the brink of self-destruction. So they came...
Hitler was intent on developing this new weapon.
Yes, and there is evidence that in fact they developed many advanced weapons. Some of them had similarities to nuclear explosions. Others were even more effective in that they could create the equivalent of a nuclear explosion but without the radioactive waste. And these are currently used. The same weapons have been developed and more refined. From the US, it's called the MOAB. Now the technical term is different, but the common terminology of the abbreviation is mother of all bombs. What it does is it releases a fine mist of propellant and then lights it up. So it creates a massive explosion spanning half a kilometer or more, but it burns it up, and because it burns it, it creates a suction, and so it pulls air from outside. So it sucks out the oxygen, the air from outside rushes, so there's an explosion outward followed by an implosion inward, which is enough to destroy everything. And nothing survives, no life form. But depending on how it is used, sometimes buildings can survive. Or depending on how it's done, again, buildings may also be equally flattened out. But these kinds of weapons were developed at that time. So obviously for any higher intelligence or more developed race who has been probably through similar passages, because it's a developmental passage of the intellect really. The intellect seized by the ego now wanting to take upon nature's powers and turn them against your own humankind. And Sri Aurobindo documents this beautifully in Savitri. That passage is inevitable for every civilization at some point or other. And they've been through it, they're worried for you. And so there were a series of contacts with beings from other planets coming in the late 40s, early 50s. Many of them were recorded by the military of all these countries because they were wondering, is it the Soviets coming to the US? And the Soviets were wondering, is it the Americans coming to the USSR? And they would monitor these things. When they would send a missile to knock it out, this thing would just zip around. And there was no way to hit them.
But last time you spoke about them targeting missiles and bringing them down. So these flying saucers were susceptible to being destroyed?
Yes. So there were examples where human beings tried to knock them out in order to reverse engineer the technology. In most cases they would try to avoid. Occasionally they did get knocked down, not by missile, not by bullets, but when high energy beams were sent towards them. So when a radar system was developed which was so powerful, it could mess up their internal electronics. Some of them did crash. And the US military is on record for having set up such systems at many places where flying saucers were regularly coming. And what it did was, of course, the same UFOs had to come, or unidentified flying saucers, had to come either avoid those spaces or had to come at a level which was semi-materialized. So that's part of the technology some of them have, not all. Some of them are entirely bound to the physical processes. They still use methods of propulsion which are very efficient, which we'll discuss. But there are others which also semi-dematerialize, and then they can move at rapid pace without being bound to the gross physical laws. They seem to have practically no inertia. So the flying saucer goes like that and then zips left, goes zigzag, and nothing in our physics can explain this. If you're flying at a speed which is 5 times the speed of sound, and then you make a sudden right-hand turn, it's enough to kill everybody inside. But you cannot even make it because the propulsion involved would push one way and you'd still end up making a curve because of the inertia.
And it would be so many G's that the body would just disintegrate.
Exactly. So the only way this can be done is if you are somehow able to neutralize inertia. So for the beings inside, they will feel nothing. They're flying at high speed one way, they make a sharp turn, they feel no momentum at all. Now is this possible? So 2 things are required. First, the ability to neutralize inertia. Second thing is the ability to overcome gravitation. And then the third thing would be to have the enormous energy necessary, the propellant or energy source, to be able to sustain this kind of thing for whatever distance or time that it takes. And it would have to be huge, obviously, to lift such something which is so big. Now, how big are these? They have documented discs which are about this size, which are recorded with cameras. And many of the crop circles have been visited by discs like that, which seem to create the crop circles. They have larger discs which are about 30 feet in diameter. And these are often the what they call scout ships, smaller ships which can move around on the planet. And then when they go out of the atmosphere, they join with a larger mothership, which can be half a kilometer or 1 kilometer in length. That's the type which I had seen over Pondicherry, which we discussed last time. And so the smaller things go inside the bigger thing, and then the bigger thing moves with a different propulsion or much faster. Cigar shaped is how they call it. And now, so the 3 things need to be viewed. How do you overcome inertia? How do you overcome gravitation? How do you have energy? Now, all of this seems almost science fiction-ish, as if something to be done in the future. You'll be surprised to know experiments to do these 3 things are recorded in the 1930s, as early as 1920s. And for some reason, the documentation is there, reports are there, magazines publish the results of these experiments, and some of them are dramatic. For some reason, all of this is as if held withdrawn, kept away from textbooks, so that humanity may not have access to the technology and the implications that the technology has. And so just briefly look at the implication. What if you had a way to neutralize gravity and move at rapid speed, sitting in a little device the size of a car? What would you do? Where would your car go? Remember, you can float off and go anywhere. Where would you go? You would fly up. You would wander all over the earth. What's your mood? Shall we go across to the other side of the earth? And it'll take you barely half an hour to get there at the speeds that you can, or maybe less.
Yes.
So let's go for a picnic on the other side of the world. Suddenly, passports and visas have no value. You cannot prevent people from going anywhere where they want. And since you're traveling vertically, you go up, you travel where you want, and land on someone's terrace. No privacy. And if a terrorist decides to use this as a vehicle, well, you have a built-in missile which can travel at high speed, knock into anything. So if you think about the rationale of holding back the technologies, it makes a lot of sense if the civilization is still crude, still has people who are crazy and want to harm and destroy others, or do not respect each other, and so on. So maybe that may be a justification for holding back. But on the other hand, precisely because the technologies are held back, you have unequal development and oppression from one part of humanity over others.
You spoke two things I wanted to pick up. One of them is about these science fiction writers. Because Mother says that nothing can be imagined that isn't already in existence.
True.
And some of them have written extraordinary works
Yes.
about this very thing we're talking about.
Exactly. In fact, many writings which were science fiction 50 years ago became the norm today,
Yes.
isn't it? In fact, the Mother herself records what she sees of the future in a way that at that time you had no vocabulary for. I give an example. She's speaking of the use of money. And then she says, at a certain point, she says, eventually in the future, the whole thing will change. It will become a barter system. But that's still far away. And that's what she wanted in Auroville, to be free of money. But before that, she says, now remember, she is seeing something and trying to describe how it works. She says, they will find a way to somehow connect all the financial transactions with a central location. So that when you go and make a purchase, you will have no physical money, and the amount which you are paying will be deducted from your account and credited to the other fellow's account. Of course, she's using a different vocabulary. But the idea is this, that you do not carry physical money. Somewhere in one center, the transaction is actually made of a transfer of numbers from one person to another. And they'll find a way to connect from that center to where you are. Now imagine in the 1950s when she says this, people will say, oh, this is impossible. How can you connect a great distance with radio waves? No, but you can't have radio waves for each person. It would be unimaginable. Today with your mobile phone, you're doing that all the time.
All right.
You're completely cashless
Yeah.
in certain parts of the world. And so it's something like this. You glimpse a future, and you glimpse it because it's already waiting to emerge. It's already waiting to actualize itself. Or maybe in other parts of the universe it has actualized. And you glimpse those things and try to articulate them. Sometimes they are things of the subtle worlds that you glimpse. So many of the, what we call fantasy fiction, involve, gnomes and elves and things like that. And some of them can, dragons flying and all those things, may belong to the subtler worlds which are glimpsed by the writer and articulated here. But here's the interesting thing. In the physical world, which is evolutionary, all possibilities of the subtle worlds are trying to actualize. And if they're trying to actualize, then eventually they have to succeed. And if not on our Earth, on some other planets, surely.
But could these not be also occult worlds?
Yes, they are occult worlds for us, but whatever is there is trying to actualize in the physical world. So given enough time, somewhere in the universe, they will find an entry point to organize themselves. And dragons do exist. If we look back at our own past, we have pterodactyls which are dragon-like, but maybe a dragon which breathes fire may belong to the subtle worlds, but in the physical world it may not breathe fire the same way, but it may still give out certain gases which are overwhelming. Methane, for example, which could burn, and so something of that recognized is what you see as in the vision as fire. Could be.
So we get back to our main subject, and free energy and
Yes.
0-point energy.
And overcoming gravitation
Yes.
and things like
Yes.
that. So what is fascinating is there is, for example, a series of articles in the 1920s written by one American scientist who was experimenting with something and by accident discovered that every time that he switched on a high voltage device for X-rays, the whole object where he was putting the field, it moved. So subsequently developing it, he discovered that it had nothing to do with any other electrical effect. It had a gravitational character. So it was called the Biefeld-Brown effect because of the names of the two people who worked on it. Townsend Brown was the scientist. He then has a whole article which is available even today, How I Control Gravity. That's the name of the article. He describes in detail how to create this effect, and he documents how when you repeatedly apply this effect, an object like that can be made to move against gravity and stay up. And how do you explain this? With current physics, you do not explain it. And it's documented. He tells you how to make it. In those days, unfortunately, we didn't have video recorders, but you have the drawings and the data of his papers which are published. And subsequently, he develops that technology, particularly during the Second World War, because the military got very interested in it. He develops it, and the first demonstration he makes to the US Navy is so dramatic because he creates a flying disc which moves at such a high speed. It is so dramatic that they classify the demonstration. And then he's moved into some secret program where they're trying to develop those technologies. If you look at his patents, the shape of his device is disc-like because of the nature of the high voltages used. And he's conceptualizing a long torpedo-shaped or cigar-shaped object for high-speed propulsion. And they're all part of his patents, which are available. That's right, you found it. You just have to search the name Townsend Brown, and you'll find a lot of literature on this. Except that, afterwards there's an attempt to suppress all that technology. And it's classified.
And one can understand with the Cold War and everything else.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yes.
But this is one example. But there are many streams of such technology. I'll give another example. This was in London. A scientist working on developing different kinds of antenna. So he creates a spiral-shaped antenna, and he finds that when he pulses it in a particular way, the whole antenna, rather than broadcasting radio waves, simply floats up into the air, anti-gravity. Now, how simple is it? All you have to do is pulse a particular shaped coil in a particular way, and you have anti-gravity. And the natural shape of it is a long cylinder, cigar-shaped. Now, this is all going back to 1920s. Let's fast forward now. After the Second World War, when many of these technologies were actually activated and taken up seriously because now you needed it for the Cold War. 1950, 51, 52, 53. You will find a series of articles appearing in all the major defense journals and aeronautical journals, with the then CEO or managing director of Boeing, Northrop, and all the British air, whatever the, don't remember the terms of those companies anymore, all these people working in building aeroplanes. The heads of these companies now making public statements that we are at the end of aeronautical age. What's aeronautics? Aeronautics is when you have a plane wing and the air has to flow over the wing to give it a lift. That's aeronautics. And they say we are at the end of the age of aeronautics because once you overcome gravity, you don't care the shape of the wings. In fact, you don't want wings anymore.
You don't need them.
You don't need them.
No.
And so you should be able to move fast. You don't want wings and you don't need aeronautics. What happens when aeronautics ends? Then you move into anti-gravity. They're speaking of gravitation control, gravitational modification, and all this is happening by the biggest names of these companies making crafts up to 1953. And there are, in those days, all the popular science journals, even one is called Popular Science, they had these articles about the anti-gravity age, which is imminent within a few years. Okay, some of them say within 2 years we are going to announce this. Now they are not saying this if they have not already done the research. I've seen a video in which the head of Skunk Works, which is the specialized research unit of what's the company? Huh? Northrop? No, what's the other? Well, one of these military companies, one of the biggest ones. The head of research, he's saying that, in those days we had discovered that if you take two magnets and you force the north and north side of each, north pulls south, north repels north. You force it together and tie it, and then you drop a magnet like this versus another object. The object where you force to the north and north to be together, it falls slower than the other. Okay? Now here's a very simple magnetic mechanism you can test at home to demonstrate a shift in gravity. And he's saying this in, I believe it was in the 90s, just before he died. He said, so we were experimenting with these technologies. He doesn't go further because after that it gets classified. But the point being, all this knowledge was available and it was imminent, and then suddenly, 1953-54, they all go silent.
And now it's 65 years from then.
Exactly. They all go silent, and the next thing you see, in all these journals, they begin to ridicule the concept of anti-gravity. And now the whole media, the entire educational system is drilled in with ridiculing of anti-gravity, where the biggest names in the industry were saying it is imminent within a year or two at that point. Why? And this is a question to think about. Why would they all go silent suddenly? And it can't be just military. It can't be just we will protect our secrets from someone else. And the understanding which I have from whatever studies I've made is that the technology is so simple to overcome gravity or to draw enormous amounts of energy. It is so simple that anybody sitting in their garage with a little bit of skill can hack it together. And if you can hack it, then how do you control people? How do you control borders? How do you control the global economy which is based on oil? You can't. And so a decision was made, because it was so easy, to turn the full attention of the world away from these directions of exploration by ridiculing, etc. And one of the reasons why the whole knowledge of and information of the photographs of measurements of flying saucers, all of which are military data recorded, many of them declassified today. The reason why all this was suppressed is so that people will not start thinking in that direction. Because the moment you see a flying saucer come and land silently with no exhaust fumes, you ask, how do they fly? And when you see the phenomena around them, you are convinced they go up and float. You're convinced that they have anti-gravity. And if they can do it, why can't I?
So who has done this? The cabal?
It's the cabal. Well, the group which has done it, we call them the cabal.
Yes, I understand.
Who want to keep the world somehow in the grip. They want you to be their slaves. And for that, you cannot enslave people. The Second World War has changed the world completely. You cannot enslave people by putting them in cages and behind barbed wires. You can only enslave them in the mind. And so the entire educational system has been warped to prevent you from thinking in certain directions, for which you have to kill creativity. Otherwise, people will inevitably go in the right direction. So you have to create strong forces to discourage by ridiculing. Do not talk about this, talk about that. And then hypnotize people to worry about things which are trivial and meaningless. Keep them, the communists spoke of religion as the opiate of the masses.
Yeah.
Well, that's not true. It is entertainment industry which is the opiate of the masses. So you keep watching TV, watch television, get sucked into some kind of a crude, lower vital enjoyment and entertainment, never turning to higher things. And if a few people turn to the higher things, well, you have to co-opt them and put them into slots where they're busy doing things which go away from those areas they don't want you to know. And here's the problem. Today, for example, if you speak of anti-gravity, even if you demonstrate with rational physics or mathematics, your paper will not be published because there are certain keywords you're not allowed to use. They don't want you talking or thinking in that direction. Nobody is going to grant you funds. If you control the fund sources for research, you can direct the research in whichever direction you want. So this is the reality we're struggling with today. In spite of this, here's the interesting thing. Repeatedly, people have continued to discover these technologies because anybody who innovates and applies a little bit of reason will find it. And the moment you find it, you start publicizing it, they either get knocked out, they die under mysterious circumstances, or they suddenly grow silent and their patent is classified or withdrawn. And you see this repeatedly.
Paid for it or something like
Yes,
that.
they're paid for
to keep them
or
silent,
threatened
yeah.
into silence,
Yes.
along with rewards to keep
Yes,
silent.
right.
And there's so many of them. I will share with you. Unfortunately, I've had contact with a few of them. And I've been, unfortunately, because, well, they died soon after. And it is extraordinary. I've met 3 people who were involved directly in this kind of research. And I discovered them too late. And within a year of my meeting them, all 3 of them died. And it was as if I was given the opportunity to meet them just to see conclusively, yes, this is real and there is a rationale behind it. But it was just at the end. If it was done sooner, perhaps much more could have been done, but that's how it is. So there are things out there, and for those who are interested, I'll be happy to give links or further reading material of content of this kind. One example I will share with you though, this is a British aeronautical engineer who from the 1950s was in the field, extremely creative and insightful. When you read his books, you say, wow, why didn't I think of that? And what he does in one of his first books, he analyzes the flying saucers reports. So for example, in one case when a flying saucer came very close, people noticed that there was radio interference. They saw a flying saucer take off. Inevitably, first they rise slowly and then zip off suddenly. Why don't they zip off from where they are? And occasionally when they do zip off, you find a chunk of the earth pulled out. So all of these observations allow you to deduce what kind of technology is involved. How does it work? So he applies his engineering mind. Based on these observations, he literally rebuilds the foundations of these technologies. And so his first book, which he published, discussed this and went quite deep into the whole matter. And remember, this must have been in the 60s, I think, late 60s that he published his book. It was to be published in the usual letterpress, which was all available at that time. And he documents how he had the last proofs which he had okayed. It went back, and when the printed book came, he said entire paragraphs had been misplaced, words had been replaced, and it was trash. And the pile of books which was delivered to him was soggy, wet with water. Now he said it was clear somebody had intervened to damage the work that he had done, and he had lost all the, he was printing it of his own money, he lost all his money in the process. Then he began to serialize some of these chapters in the New York Times. So a few chapters came, a major newspaper in the US, in New York, and after that the rest was to be coming in the book, which was to be published in New York. The company which was publishing it suddenly went bankrupt. After printing 4,000 copies, they pulped the 4,000 copies and they went bankrupt. A year later, the company comes back, it's back in print with all their earlier titles, only this one title missing, and it goes on. And all the money which he had paid for the printing is gone. And when you find repeatedly interventions like that, you know that something more serious is afoot. And then he documents one more incident where a US official from the US military came to visit because he was working in one of the British aeronautical companies. So this official comes for an official visit, he goes through, and at the end of the visit, he says to the head of the company, for God's sake, man, just tell me, stop hiding. How far are you with negative gravity. Because this man had published this book, they assumed the company was doing research in negative gravity. And so the head of the company was scratching his head. He couldn't say, no, we are not doing, because he didn't know what issues were involved. He said, oh, we have just touched 0.5%. And the official gave a broad grin, satisfied that they were nowhere close, and he walks away. Now, all of this is part of the documentation of this man's life, showing you that everybody was interested in his books. Copies of what he finally did print sold out, but after that nobody wanted to print any more copies. Now that book is available for easily, but not publicized anymore. So to show you that people have not only discovered, but they've always been sidelined, suppressed, because there are forces which don't want this radical change. If you think of it, look back, electric cars were the norm in 1905. Did you know that? They were all electric to begin with because it's the most efficient way of doing it. And then it was as if the electric car was killed, and instead they brought these fossil fuel based internal combustion engines, which took many decades to perfect, to become efficient enough. Even then, if you look at internal combustion engines of 1970s and 80s, the USA had the most inefficient engines. The Japanese were producing mileage which was like almost double of the US. Why would you do that? Why would you not allow higher efficiency? And it's because of the oil industry, which wants to keep people paying money by keeping things inefficient.
Well, thank you so much. It was wonderful.
Yes.
We'll take a break.